Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a massive question. Why are 37.8 million people in the Greater Horn of Africa facing severe hunger right now? It's really easy to just point at the sky, blame the lack of rain, and move on. But as we're going to see by digging into the actual source data today, this crisis is way more than just a bad weather event. It's actually a giant systemic domino effect, and we're going to break the whole thing down.
Let's kick things off with a pretty staggering number from the World Health Organization's latest situation report, 37.8 million. That is how many people in this region are currently experiencing or projected to experience acute food insecurity. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Canada. It's an incredibly massive number. Kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? But we've got to remember, every single one of those millions represents a real human life caught up in a systemic failure, literally struggling to find their next meal.
So that naturally makes us ask, how does a crisis get this big? Is it literally just a lack of rain, or is there something far more complex going on? Well, when we look closely at the research, we find that a drought is really just the very first domino to fall. What comes next is this compounding cascade, economic, infrastructural, and health collapses that ultimately pulls the food right out of a family's bowl. To answer that, here is our roadmap for today. 1. Anatomy of a drought. 2. The economic ripple effect. 3. Compounding health crises. And 4. Building regional resilience.
All right, Section 1. Anatomy of a drought, and how climate shocks are intensifying.
Looking closely at the data from Ethiopia, we can see this physical escalation perfectly. Back during the 2011 La Niña drought, about 4.8 million people were affected. But just a few years later, the 2016 El Niño event was drastically more severe and spread out over a much wider geographic area. It impacted a staggering 10.2 million people and ended up costing 2.1% of Ethiopia's total GDP. Think about what that actually means on the ground. For a developing economy, a 2.1% overnight drop in GDP is absolutely catastrophic. It wipes out livelihoods in an instant. The data clearly shows these climate shocks aren't static. They are increasing in both their scope and their economic destruction.
And if we zoom out and look at the historical data spanning over a century, Ethiopia actually ranks third globally for the total population affected by droughts, number 3 in the world. That tells us that extreme weather isn't just some sudden anomaly here, it's basically the baseline. Yet, even knowing this intense historical vulnerability hasn't prevented 37.8 million people from going hungry today. To understand exactly why that is, we've got to look completely past the farms.
Which brings us to Section 2, the economic ripple effect, moving beyond just agriculture. Now, this is where the research completely flips our traditional understanding. We almost always think of drought as just a farming problem, right? But in Ethiopia, 87% of the electricity comes from hydropower. So step 1, the rain stops, and agricultural inputs drop. But step 2 is the hidden crisis. Those hydropower reservoirs completely deplete. That leads to step 3. The government is forced to implement rolling blackouts on manufacturing plants just to save energy, which inevitably triggers step 4. Factories grind to a complete halt. So a lack of rain literally turns the lights off on the entire industrial economy.
The source research confirms this causes manufacturing total factor productivity, which is basically just an economic measure of how efficiently a factory turns raw materials into finished, sellable goods, to plummet by up to 3.5%. And this next piece of data really surprised me. These negative effects actually persist over time. The factories don't just magically bounce back the moment it starts raining again. They suffer from deep, lingering damage that stunts overall economic growth for years.
This brings us to a pretty devastating economic reality called supply chain hysteresis. What that means is the drought damages the productive capacity of the agricultural base so severely that even after the rains finally return, the essential business relationships remain completely broken. Imagine you're a local factory owner, right? Your local suppliers go bankrupt during the drought. When it finally rains, you can't just flip a switch and start manufacturing again because your entire network of trust, credit lines, and raw material buffers has completely evaporated. The industrial supply chain stays fractured.
So you might be wondering, why don't these businesses just adapt? Well, when surveyed, 67% of firms cited a lack of access to credit as their primary barrier. Another 54% cited uncertainty about future droughts. This proves we are looking at a massive, structural market failure. Businesses desperately want to prepare, but they literally cannot finance it. And here is where we connect right back to our core question for today. Why are 37.8 million people hungry? Because when factories stall, workers are laid off. When workers lose wages, they stop buying from local markets. The entire rural and urban economy basically collapses together. Moving on to Section 3, Compounding Health Crises and the Grade 2 Emergency. Because of these cascading failures, the World Health Organization has actually classified the situation in the Greater Horn of Africa as a Grade 2 emergency. That means it requires a moderate to major international response just to keep the region's health systems from entirely buckling under the immense pressure. And the risk of preventable illness and death falls heaviest on the highly vulnerable demographic groups you're seeing here: children under 5, pregnant and lactating women, displaced populations, refugees, and pastoralist communities who have just lost their livelihoods entirely.
The ultimate human cost of this compounding crisis is honestly heart-wrenching. The WHO projects that over 4.9 million children will suffer acute malnutrition, and over 1.5 million of those children will require direct treatment for severe acute malnutrition. When the farms fail, the factories stall, and the credit markets dry up, it's ultimately the children who absorb the brunt of this systemic economic collapse in their own bodies.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, Building Regional Resilience, focusing on solutions and responses.
To address the immediate, life-threatening symptoms of this crisis, the WHO clearly outlines that they require approximately $25.4 million. But pay attention to the time frame here. This is just for the 6 months between July and December of 2026. Keep in mind, this isn't to fix the structural industrial issues we were just talking about. This is strictly emergency funding just to keep people alive for half a year. This funding is urgently needed to reinforce disease surveillance, expand nutrition stabilization centers for those 1.5 million severely malnourished children we mentioned, and ensure the continuity of essential health services across the 6 affected countries. But as our data shows, emergency health funding, while incredibly vital, literally life-saving, is ultimately just catching the very last domino right as it falls.
So how do we actually stop the first domino from falling? Well, as highlighted in the environmental conservation data, true long-term resilience demands that we integrate our approaches. We have to prioritize water management specifically for climate change adaptation, or CCA. We've got to start treating water not just as a farming resource, but as the foundational battery that powers the entire industrial, financial, and health ecosystem. I want to leave you with this final thought today. To solve global hunger for those 37.8 million people, we have to completely rethink climate resilience. Because as we've seen, droughts shut down power grids, shatter supply chains, and freeze credit markets. To actually save 37.8 million people from hunger, climate resilience absolutely must be viewed as an industrial and financial imperative. Will we adapt our systems fast enough to break this cycle before the next shock hits? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.